Good afternoon, Prime Minister. It's been reported that the government has cancelled the no-deal Brexit ferry contracts. Is that the case? And if so, how much is it going to cost?
Well, if I can come on to the ferry contracts, I wondered if it would be helpful, before I did that, if I sort of set the scene as you're interested in where we are on negotiations and what we're doing. And
Prime Minister, because we have quite a lot of questions.
I'm sure it may be that my setting the scene will answer some of those questions.
Okay.
I think that's because I think if I update, obviously it's our policy to leave the EU in as orderly a fashion as soon as possible, and I regret the fact that it hasn't been possible. I've voted 3 times to do it, but obviously we haven't built a majority across the House. And obviously, as everybody knows, the House has also rejected no deal and other actions, including the people's vote, and by the legislation that was passed, compelled us to seek an extension. And as you know, I sought that extension until the 30th of June, but the Council, after lengthy deliberations, gave that extension until the 31st of October, but it's terminable. So we can leave at any point up until that time, and we will leave at the end of the month in which Parliament ratifies the withdrawal agreement. I think this is important because I want that to happen before the October deadline. And I think that once a consensus is reached, members should look to pass the necessary legislation and end the uncertainty as soon as is practically possible. We've been making concerted efforts to build on that consensus. Cross-party discussions on workers' rights, for example, making it clear we'd accept the amendment tabled by Gareth Snell and Lisa Nandy on the role of Parliament. And obviously we asked the House to ratify the withdrawal agreement itself, which the House chose not to do. But obviously then, following that, the Cabinet agreed that the right thing for us to do was to reach out to the opposition in order to decide how we can build a majority for the ratification of the withdrawal agreement and leaving. And I think that was unprecedented, but I'm convinced it was the right thing to do because public want to see us working together to deliver the result of the referendum. And we've been having constructive, meaningful talks which are continuing. There are differences on issues, but on many of the key areas, particularly on the withdrawal agreement, there's common ground. And we know that we need to end this uncertainty and do it as soon as possible. And I hope that the deal can be done. We certainly approach this with an open mind. But if we're not able to do that, then we will bring votes to the House in order to determine what the House can support. And we stand ready to abide by that decision if the opposition are willing to do so. Obviously, I'm sure there'll be lots of technical questions, but I think the choice before the House remains the choice that has always been before the House in relation to this issue, which is we can form a majority to ratify and leave with a deal, we can decide to leave with no deal, we can go back to the people, admit failure and ask them to think again, or we could revoke Brexit. Those are the choices. I think the one that's the only acceptable is to form a majority to ratify the withdrawal agreement. Meanwhile, and I will continue to work and do everything I can to enable us to do that because I think that's what's right in the national interest. What we do, meanwhile, of course, is continue our preparations. Part of the issues around the preparations for no deal, which I've just been asked about in relation to the ferry contracts. Those ferry contracts, because in the light of the extension that I've just referenced, we're reviewing the contingency planning that's taken place in relation to no deal. We've decided to terminate the contracts with Brittany Ferries and DFDS. Those contracts were a vital contingency measure, ensuring that critical goods like medicines could enter the UK in the event of disruption along the short straits in a no-deal scenario. But they both included early termination fees to ensure that we would not have to pay the full contract cost in the event that the capacity was no longer needed.
How much will it cost to cancel the contracts?
It will cost less than it would to carry on running the contracts.
Leo estimated it would be, I think, around 56 million quid. Could you confirm that figure?
I'd write to the committee with figures, but I think if we're talking about the question of costs, the point I've just made is an important one, which is that the combined termination costs with the operators is substantially lower than the national. It is actually lower than the NAO's recent estimate of termination costs, thanks to the decisions we took. But it's also lower than keeping those contracts on. I'm sure everybody would agree that we have to take the decision that is best in terms of the use of taxpayers' money.
I understand that entirely, but does that mean that the government has now accepted that there won't be a no-deal Brexit? In other words, If you have accepted that, I can see why you cancel the contracts and won't need them anymore, or might you have to stand them up again if we come to the 31st of October without an agreement? What is the government's policy now on a no-deal Brexit?
The government's policy is that we want to leave the European Union with a deal, and that is what we continue to work for. But of course, it is not entirely in the hands of the government as to what happens there. First of all, Parliament has to ratify an agreement that enables us to leave with a deal, and so far Parliament has not been willing to do that, although Parliament has also not been willing to accept no deal. But the extension and decision at the end of that, were we to get to that 31st of October date, without a deal ratified, and therefore without us having left the European Union, I sincerely hope we don't come to that position. It would not simply be a decision for the government as to what happened, because obviously at that point, were there to be a request for a further extension, that would be in the hands of the 27 members of the European Union as well.
Now, you referred to the talks with the opposition. If they can't reach agreement, as you've just said, you're going to put a number of options to the House. Will that include an option for a customs union?
What we would intend to do would be to discuss with the opposition, because we would want this to be a process with which we had discussed with the official opposition and which they were willing to support. We would discuss with them the options that would be put before the House.
Include a customs union?
We would discuss the options that would be put before the House.
Well, since the opposition is arguing for a customs union, one would have thought that they'd be very happy to see that put to the vote. Well, would it include a customs union?
One of the discussions that we have been having, and I've made this, I've said this sort of thing publicly as well, is the whole question about customs arrangements for the future. Various terms are used in relation to customs. Sometimes people use different terms to mean the same thing. Sometimes it's meaning different approaches. But what I think would be important when we come to that process is that anything that is put before the House, and obviously customs unions been put before the House previously and been rejected by the House, anything that I would hope that we'd be able to get agreement with the opposition, so there's a process that everybody can stand behind.
Could it include a second referendum, a confirmatory referendum? One of those options?
That's a question of a different order, isn't it? That's not a question of the substance of the deal that would be required in order to ratify the withdrawal agreement. That's about process in relation to an issue. And as we know, there are differences of opinion in relation to a second referendum, and neither we, as the party in government, nor the official opposition, have a policy of second referendum in all circumstances.
Johnson says it's a perfectly coherent proposition. Do you agree with him?
It's a proposition that has been put by a number of members of the House, inside this House and elsewhere. That
coherent proposition.
My view about a second referendum is that we should get on with delivering the first referendum. And that's what people want us to do. That's what people expect us to do. It is what the government at the time of the referendum said we would do.
Can I turn, secondly, to the UK's plans and negotiating objectives for Phase 2 if a deal is agreed? Can you just confirm who will lead those negotiations for the UK side? Will it be the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union?
That is, I think we would have a different arrangement for the negotiations. I think most likely it would be led by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. But if I can just explain, obviously the next stage of negotiations, Phase 2 of negotiations, includes a wide range of issues. And of course it would be necessary to be able to draw cross-expertise from across government on all of the matters that were involved. For example, one element of it is going to be security aspects. So obviously making sure that those who are expert and well-versed in those are part of those negotiations is going to be important.
And what would be your role, or the role of your successor, if that's what happens, in the negotiations? How would that be handled with the Secretary of State?
Well, there would be, the Secretary of State would, of course, operate according to policy that is set by the government. So there would be not just a role for that individual and a role for the Prime Minister, but of course a role for the Cabinet.
Is the government ready for the negotiations? I ask because the Secretary of State announced about a month ago the government was planning to set up an expert advisory group of technical experts in trade and customs. Has that group been established?
There are various pieces of work that are being done. Some of the announcements have been made, have been in relation to work that we will do on looking, for example, at alternative arrangements to the backstop in the withdrawal agreement. We would be wanting to extend the input that we had on these matters in the second phase of negotiations, and that's why we've referenced not just experts on issues like trade and customs, but also a greater interaction with business generally, with trade unions and with civil society.
Have any of them been established yet?
Well,
Because it took the government a year and a half to decide what to ask for in the negotiations, and what I'm trying to establish is whether in fact the government is ready for phase 2 negotiations if we get to that point. And so the question I'm asking is, you've announced you want to set up a group of technical experts in trade and customs. Has it been established yet?
What you will have seen is actually it didn't take the government a year and a half to decide what it was going to ask for in the negotiations. I set out the outline of what the government was going to ask for in the Lancaster House speech, which was in early 2017. We then obviously fleshed that out in the letter triggering Article 50. We then went through, obviously we had the discussions focusing initially on the withdrawal agreement aspect of the arrangements with the European Union. But as you look at the political declaration, you will see a great deal in there, which has been, from the government's point of view, a lot of it hard fought in order to ensure that we can have a situation going into the second phase of negotiations that meets the requirements for the United Kingdom. As we go forward, at the moment, obviously the whole question of what those objectives should be, and we've seen, as I said, the amendment that Gareth Snell and Lisa Nandy put down about Parliament having a greater role in that. That whole issue is one that is for further discussion.
Are you concerned, finally, that time is being lost because with each month of extension of Article 50, that is a month off the transition period?
Well, I would have far preferred us.
I know that.
Yes, I would have far preferred us to leave on the 29th of March. Indeed, if everyone across the House of Commons had voted the way I did, we would already no longer be member of the European Union.